Hello, everybody. Welcome back to class. It's Bram Duffee. We're talking about Unit 4 this week, and Unit 4 has to do with the complexity of verbal communication. So, it's just true that verbal communication is the foundation for how we create meaning, build relationships, and express who we are. It's how we connect and share and understand one another. And it's a lot more layered than just talking. Verbal communication has functions and structures. There are even nuances that deeply influence the way that we interact with others. So today we'll be talking about how to break all this down piece by piece. So verbal communication does help shape our identities and relationships. And the words we choose reflect who we are, our personality, background, and even our culture. So think about how language or slang or expressions that are out there that tie you to a specific community or a region. For example, someone saying y'all likely hints at Southern roots, right? So beyond identity, verbal communication plays a key role in building connections, whether it's a meaningful conversation with a friend or a small talk with a coworker. It's like our words lay the foundation for our relationships. But the power of verbal communication just doesn't stop with the relationships. It's also a little bit about how we perceive ourselves in our environment, because by using words to define and describe events or emotions, we can influence our own thinking. So, for instance, if we label an event as a challenge instead of a crisis, then that shifts perspective and can even encourage problem solving. So this subtle psychological role makes verbal communication not just a tool for interaction, but also a driver of inner growth and resilience. There's a lot of purposes out there for communication, and language isn't just about forming sentences. It's a tool that we use when we are working to meet different needs. And so we have the need for when language helps us get what we want. And so if we're trying to get something we want, then we say, hey, can I have a slice of pizza, right? There's an instrumental kind of focus for what can happen with that. The other is regulatory. So when we influence people's behavior, people around us, like saying, hey, don't forget to turn out the lights, or something that makes that connection, it is influencing others or around us, and that's one way that we can do that. Also, we inform through communication, right? So sharing facts, like, hey, the meeting starts at 3. So we also work together to ask questions and find out things from one another. It's an interactional process, because that interactional process creates social connections and helps us, mesh and connect. There's a personal part to that when we express our own individuality and share our opinions and our concerns. And also an imaginative component as well, because we do tell stories and we do play with words. So each function adds to how we connect with the world. So whether you're giving directions or telling a joke or having a heartfelt conversation, it's just the functions of language allow us to use the words with purpose. Now, next is the building blocks of language. And to truly understand communication, we need to explore how languages are structured. Every language has specific components to how it works. And so phonology focuses on sounds. So, for example, the th sound in the English can be really tricky for some because it doesn't exist in their language. Syntax is another part. Syntax is about grammar and word order. So, for instance, in English, we say, I like ice cream, not ice cream I like, right? So it's just the syntax, the way that the words are ordered matters and also can have a meaning. Semantics refers to exactly that meaning. So words have a meaning like a dictionary meaning, but also they have a connotative meaning. And that connotative meaning adds like an emotional depth to the word. And even the word home could have that kind of emotional depth because in one way you could be describing home like houses that are built, and another way you could be describing your own home. And so those do have different meanings. The other thing is pragmatics. And pragmatics involves adapting language to specific social context. So, for example, how you ask for help from a professor will be probably different than how you ask for help from a friend or a boss. So understanding these components helps streamline communication, making it smoother and more effective. And when we master these building blocks, it can help us tailor our messages so that we're set up right for different audiences or different settings. So I want to talk about some conversational rules. Pragmatics brings us to something called speech act theory. And speech act theory suggests that words themselves can create actions. So when you say, I promise, it's not like you're just stating something, you're committing to it. And so in that respect, that's considered a speech act. And speech acts can be direct or indirect, right? So a direct speech act would be like saying, hey, pass the salt. Or versus an indirect act would be to say, wow, this food could use a little more flavor. So interpreting speech acts requires a cultural and a contextual knowledge. Miscommunication often happens when we assume that there's a shared understanding, but then we miss these subtleties. And it makes me just connect to thinking about times of war when soldiers have interpreters and how that's very much needed, because even the soldier might just know the direct language, but the indirect components would only have been known by the person who came from that culture. So these kinds of things are set up all throughout our language, and conversations rely on certain rules. And so turn taking, for instance, is something that ensures balance. And it's because interruptions disrupt flow and pauses create space for others to contribute. Also contextual rules are out there, and they're things that help guide what's appropriate. Like joking in casual settings works well, but might not feel in the same place if you're in a formal setting. So knowing these rules keeps conversation smooth and respectful. Some people are language sticklers, and they follow really hardcore rules like this is how we should read, this is how we should write. And other folks lead more towards saying, hey, it just depends on the situation, and maybe, just observing how the language evolves naturally is the better idea. But it's not like any one of these ideas is wrong. It's just a matter of perspective. So understanding that both sides can expand your appreciation for how, dynamic language really is. At the same time, we have to think about the setting that we're in to make sure that if we're speaking a certain way, that we come across the way that we intended to in that environment. So there's some psychology involved in language, and it's because verbal communication doesn't just help us interact. It helps how we think and how we decide who we are. Language and psychology are powerfully intertwined, and so they influence our thoughts and our decisions and emotions. Scholars have debated and looked into this sort of interaction for ages. And so on one side of that kind of conversation, nominalists argue that any idea can be expressed in any language, and that language itself doesn't limit or shape thought. But then there's another view of folks called relativists. And relativists believe that language profoundly influences the way we experience the world. And this perspective includes the famous Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is something that suggests that language determines how we perceive reality. So consider consider this classic example tied to the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Certain indigenous Arctic languages contained a multitude of words for the word snow. And at the same time, English speakers might only see snow as one thing. Speakers of those languages might perceive a lot of subtle differences between the various types of snow because their language provides the vocabulary for it. And they're used to seeing sleet and puffy clouds put out different types of snow. And so this doesn't mean that they see the world completely different, but it just does hint at how language shapes our awareness, because on one side, the English speakers would just be calling this white stuff one thing, and the folks who are native to that area would have multiple words depending upon the type of snow that's coming down. Beyond perception, language also influences memory. Words are something that give structure to what we recall. So, for example, if you describe an event as like thrilling, then your brain is going to likely replay that memory in a vivid kind of way. Verbal labels help organize events in our minds, sometimes influencing certain details while filtering out others. Language also impacts decision making. Studies show that how we frame options influences the choices. So, for instance, describing a product as 90% effective would lead to different reactions instead of saying that it has 10% failure rate, right? Even though both of those statements are objectively the same. So language does have decision-making parts because the words that you use and the words that are tied to something do show an opinion. And the other part to talk about language playing a role in our lives is about the emotional regulation part of it. You might notice that putting feelings into words, like saying, "I'm upset," instead of bottling it up, this kind of thing can help you manage your emotions more effectively. It's a psychological process called affect labeling, and it's a key part in emotional well-being. Language helps us process complex emotions, and it's nice to be able to process complex emotions instead of letting them spiral. So here's where verbal communication gets even more fascinating. Your unique traits and life experiences are something that shape how you speak. So from the dialect to word choice, the way that we talk reflects both personal and societal influences. A dialect is like a verbal fingerprint. It reflects regional, cultural, or community influences. For example, someone in southern U.S. might use that word y'all. And I just think about how different the language might be between where I'm at here in Texas and where you're at in Georgia. There just are some distinct vowel pronunciations. And these differences are awesome because they work to enrich language and help us celebrate diversity. I want to mention that, gosh, it's true that men and women speak differently. And there are stereotypes out there that exist, but studies reveal that communication styles do depend more on the social context than the inherent differences. But expectations often shape how genders are socialized to speak. Also, there's generational slang. I watch videos that are put out by this guy who teaches junior high And it's funny because he's always going to talk about the generational slang and what the kids are saying nowadays. So young people often generate their own language norms. And so you just have to think of it as like a new slang. Words like slay or vibe or whatever, these are words that change and shift, but at the same time do represent some broader cultural shifts. And that regional accents and ethnic verbal styles, even code switching, all of this helps shape how communication happens in diverse contexts. And language is never something that's just neutral, right? It reflects societal norms and power dynamics. So, for example, there are certain dialects or accents out there that are unfairly perceived as less intelligent due to bias. And just like that, identity labels like race or gender designations also carry power or privilege, even with those who might come from dominant groups. So we think about the use of language and how the way that we speak can make decisions for us and communicate something about how we are presenting ourselves to the world and accepting those others around us. One of the big takeaways I have is verbal communication is much more than exchanging words. It's something that nurtures relationships and influences thinking. It also tells a story of who we are. So when we better understand all of the functions and structures and psychological impacts that go with language, then we don't just speak more effectively, we connect more thoughtfully. Before we end, I just want to mention that this is the Unit 4, so we'll be doing our quiz this week, and you'll have a quiz question that'll ask for a number, and so that number is 64230. 64230. You'll need that for your test. Just make sure to mark it down. 64230. All right? So this is something you should take as your mission this week. Pay attention to the words that you use. Listen deeply to the words of others, and as a result, you might be surprised at the richness of the meaning that you uncover. So I look forward to looking at your quiz stuff this week, and I look forward to your discussion board. Thanks.